Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I am here with Cheryl Smith, Marlon Story, and Natasha Presley. They are going to be giving us a really great presentation on our best practices for SAM submissions. So, as always, this is a recorded presentation. So, if you need to watch it on rerun or if you want to send it to anyone who is unable to attend this morning, it will be posted on the website probably Monday, and then that will be available for viewing whenever. Also, please remember that at the end of the training, you will receive an automated email from WebEx with your assessment, and that assessment will be open until 5 p.m. today. After 5 p.m., if you have not taken the assessment, it will not reopen. So from the end of the training at 11 o'clock until 5 p.m. today is your opportunity to take your assessment. If you receive a score of 4 or higher, you will earn your 1 credit hour for this training. So please make sure that you take the time this afternoon to get that done. Once you receive your test results, you will use that as your certificate of completion. So make sure you save that for your records. It will document when you took the test, your score, and your credit earned. So if you have any questions about that process, if you have issues accessing the assessment this afternoon, feel free to send me an email or give me a call, and we can try to figure out what's going on with that. But without further ado, I'm going to pass the presentation over to Cheryl Smith, and she will get us started.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. I'll try and talk loud so that the recording would be more effective for everybody. Thanks for joining. We're going to talk about, like Elizabeth indicated, maybe some best practices for SAM. We're not going to go through every step of the SAM, but we really want to cover some of the basic criteria and then a lot of the problem areas that we've noted, and so that hopefully things will be much easier for both the support coordinators and the reviewers to process the SAMs more effectively. So first, before you submit a SAM, you should ensure that the request meets the criteria for significant additional needs. So there's criteria both in the Florida Statute 393-0662 and also in our iBudget rule, which is 65G 4.0213. This criteria is very important to Director Palmer and the people downtown, because a SAM should never be just for stuff that people just want just to have, but there's real, serious criteria involved with requesting a SAM. And so what the rule or the statutes say is that the agency may authorize funding based on a client having one or more of the following needs that cannot be accommodated within the funding determined by the algorithm, and having no other resources, support, or services available to meet the need. So there are some things that you need to make sure that you're documenting in the documentation that you're submitting with the SAM. So one of the things is an extraordinary need that would place the health and safety of the client's caregiver, or the public in immediate serious jeopardy unless the increase is approved. And you'll see the immediate serious jeopardy language in several places throughout both the rule and the statute. So you can see, based on that language, the immediate serious jeopardy unless the increase is approved, that it's not intended to be just for services a consumer may want to have, but that they really need to have for their health and safety of themselves and others. And then it goes on to say that, however, the presence of an extraordinary need in and of itself does not warrant authorized funding by the agency. So an extraordinary need may include, but is not limited to, so here's some of the criteria, and you'll notice as we go through this criteria that this is the same criteria that you have to check when you're submitting a SAN through the SAN system. So when we actually developed the system, we took this criteria and broke it down so that you can prove when you're submitting a SAN that it meets one of these SAN criteria. So one of them may be a documented history of significant, potentially life-threatening behaviors. And the behaviors include things such as attempts at arson, non-consensual sexual behavior, or self-injurious behavior requiring medical attention. So pretty serious behaviors. A complex medical condition that requires active intervention by a licensed nurse on an ongoing basis that cannot be taught or delegated to a non-licensed person. It may be a chronic comorbid condition, which means a medical condition that exists simultaneously but independently with another medical condition. It may be a need for total physical assistance with activities such as eating, bathing, toileting, grooming, and personal hygiene. There's some other criteria for like maybe one-time needs. So that consumer may have a significant need for one-time or temporary support or services that, if not provided, would place the health and safety of the client, again, the same language, the client's caregiver or the public in serious jeopardy. So this is where your environmental accessibility adaptations or your durable medical equipment would come in. But this also may be for instances where there's like a temporary loss of a caregiver. So let's say the caregiver, is going to the hospital and will need to be in rehab for a few weeks and additional support is needed during that period of time. Or they're going out of town and maybe, an emergency or, a planned vacation and the consumer cannot or does not want to go with them. And so there's a temporary need for additional supports at that time. But this still does not warrant automatic approval of additional funds. So a significant increase in the need for services after the beginning of the service plan year that would place the health, again, same language, the health and safety of the client's caregiver, or the public in serious jeopardy because of substantial changes in the client's circumstances on a permanent or long-term basis is another possible criteria for SAN. This may include, so this is where you're aging out of Medicaid or the school system may come in. So this is something you would check for those situations. But again, this does not automatically mean that additional funds are going to be approved. Another criteria is the need for transportation. So this was added more recently to the statute and the rule. So that allows for transportation services to waiver-funded adult day training program or waiver-funded employment services that cannot be accommodated within a client's budget. So you know that a few years ago, those of you that were here, transportation wasn't identified as, a significant need for people. And our other arrangements were made. A lot of times the group home operators stepped up to provide transportation or other natural support. So just because it's now added as something that you can look at for SAN criteria doesn't mean it's automatic approval. So again, you're going to have to prove why there's no other natural support in place to provide the service. And then 65G 4.0215, which is our iBudget rule, says medical necessity alone is not sufficient to authorize a service under the waiver. So in addition to medical necessity, the support coordinator must assist the consumer with utilizing all available state plan medical services, school-based services, private insurance, natural support, and any other resources which may be available to the individual before utilizing waiver funds. So you know that state plan Medicaid provides most services that individuals under 21 need, including things like personal care assistance and therapies, including behavior therapy, consumable medical supplies, and nursing. So one thing that we see quite often is a request for increase in respite services. And we're always going to ask, what have you tried to access through Medicaid state plan? So that's important information that you should be submitting with your SAN if you're asking for something like an increase in respite, because we want to make sure that you're utilizing all other available resources prior to requesting waiver funds. The services must be within waiver coverages and limitations, so it should match the criteria in the handbook. So if somebody's requesting something that is not allowable in the handbook, like, for instance, companion services for somebody under age 21, please educate the consumer and their support team on what is available for that individual. We see quite a few requests for companion services for people under age 21, and there's just no way we can approve those. Even if there's some special situation in that individual's life, our system will prevent that from even happening. So it just cannot happen because we cannot violate the coverages and limitations in our handbook. So please help educate your families. It will make things a lot less aggravating. We don't want to go to hearings over something that, we just cannot approve because of the limitations. So APD has provided you with the job aid to assist you with submitting complete SAM packets. If you use the job aid, it will make for a quicker review and help eliminate the request for additional information. So this is a picture, but we're going to go ahead and open up the job aid so we can look at some specific parts of it. So you should see the job aid now on the screen. So first, let's look at the Section A. We're not going to look at the whole thing, but I want to point out some real important parts of this job aid. And this Section A is the checkpoint for all submissions. So this should be something you should be looking at for every SAM that you submit. So the first thing we want to see is that the support coordinator attempted to address needs within the available budget. So we want you to look at funds not currently allocated to services, so the unspent funds in the client's cost plan that can be used. Sometimes we'll get requests for like a one-time service for maybe like, $500, and the individual already has $900 sitting out there not allocated to services. There's no reason to request additional funds if funds are available. So that's something you should be looking at first. You should see if other services have been underutilized and free those funds up. So, for example, maybe somebody didn't attend their day program for several weeks because they were either unable to because they were hospitalized or they were out of town. You can free up those funds both for, the program and maybe if they have the transportation and use those funds for the other needs before you request additional funds. If you have, maybe you have a one-time need for, maybe there's equipment that the individual needs that's about $1,500. There's $1,000 available. Maybe you can free up the other $500 by adjusting things within the current plan. So is there natural supports that can maybe assist so that some of the personal supports can be reduced? Or is there unused funds that can be moved out of the plan, freed up to pay for those additional $500? So those are some things that you need to be thinking about and demonstrating in the documentation that you provide. Also, the support coordinator must include documentation that shows attempts to locate natural or community support, third-party payers, or other sources to meet the needs. This is something that the legislative staff are always asking when our management team goes downtown to make presentations and things. They always want to know that we are making sure that the support coordinator is looking at natural supports before they're requesting additional funds. So please include this type of information in the documentation that you are providing to us. You should always check the current QSI to be sure it accurately reflects the functional, behavioral, and physical status of the consumer and that it's current. If it does not, then you should be requesting a new one. Reviewers rely quite a bit on the QSI or SAM reviews because it's done by impartial staff. They don't have, it's not like the provider who has ties to funds or anything like that. So if you see, for example, one thing we see, again, quite a bit is that somebody are asking for incontinence supplies, but the QSI indicates the individual is continent. And so those are the kinds of things that we run into quite a bit, and we can't approve the incontinence supplies if the other documentation says the person is continent. Even if you give us a prescription, that says incontinent, and, you know, we're still gonna look at the QSI to make sure it's reflective. That's something that is real critical for you to be looking at, especially if it's like 2 years old, if they've had a decline in their health condition, if they've had a decline in their behavioral situation. Please make sure that the QSI is reflective of the client's current situation. And then an AIM worksheet is required anytime the consumer's algorithm has changed. So this, again, seems to be a little confusing for folks because sometimes we ask for an updated AIM and the support coordinator doesn't understand why we're asking for one. So if a consumer is changing anything that's going to change the algorithm out, so for example, they're changing their living setting. They're going from family home to group home, or they're going from family home to supported living, or if they're about to turn 21 and you're submitting a SAM for aging out. Those are the types of things that are going to change the algorithm amount for its consumer. And so anytime the algorithm amount changes, an AIM is required. And then there's some additional actions that have to be taken if you're submitting a SAM for somebody who is a CDC participant. So in addition to all the requirements that we just talked about, a consultant should provide the consumer's current approved purchasing plan, and again, documentation of efforts made to adjust the budget within the purchasing plan. So just like we just talked about with adjusting funds within a cost plan, a purchasing plan can also be amended to free up funds for an additional need that the consumer has. And then we need an explanation of savings available and how the savings were adjusted to meet the individual's needs. So savings should always be used prior to requesting additional funds. Now, if they're dedicated to a specific service with a specific end date, so let's say they're saving for a piece of equipment and they're going to buy that equipment in 2 months, as long as that's demonstrated in the documentation we receive, we're not going to use those funds for something else because it's already committed to a specific service with a specific end date. Otherwise, you need to let us know what, you need to use those savings before requesting a SAM, or let us know why they can't be used. Okay, so we're going to go back to the slide, and then we'll hit on the, okay, so we're gonna go back to that in just a minute. But we want to talk about documentation now, because documentation is critical to being able to review SAM quickly. And the documentation provided should be the most recent information that reflects the current needs of the individual. Documentation must be provided for all requested services, not just new services. So remember, this is a whole plan review, and we're not just looking at one service. So just because you're asking for everything is staying the same and you just want one thing new or one thing changed, we still are doing a whole plan review. And that's to make sure about some of the things we already talked about, that there's no other funds that can be adjusted to meet the needs. There's no available funds that aren't currently being used. So we need documentation for every service in the cost plan. And please do not send password protected documents, because we have no way to know what the password is, and having to contact somebody to find out what the password is just takes additional time. So please do not send password protected documents. Some of the documentation that is on the job aid is stuff that's specifically required in the iBudget rule. And service-specific documentation requirements are in the iBudget waiver handbook. So I want to go back to the job aid so that we can review some of the documentation that I know reviewers have to continue to ask for quite a bit. And then the others, you can just look at on your own. A complex medical condition. Okay, so I want to talk about complex medical condition. So these documents are critical anytime nursing services are being requested. So we have to ask quite a bit for additional documentation, because we do access our consultants here at state office when SAMs are being done up here. to help us look at the nursing documentation, because they are registered nurses, and they can help us interpret, some of the activities and stuff that are needed, whether they have to be done by a nurse, whether they have to be done by an RN or an LPN. And so, some of the documentation we need are, documentation from the physician or others that document the medical necessity. We have to have a prescription by the physician, ARNP, or physician assistant. We need a list of specific nursing duties to be performed, and a nursing care plan is applicable. And if you're requesting skilled nursing, you have to follow the skilled nursing exception process, because skilled nursing is covered by Medicaid state plan. And the only time that the waiver should be providing it is if you have followed the skilled nursing exception process and you've demonstrated that there are no available providers that can provide the service, and that it has to go through your medical case manager, and it has to be approved by the Agency for Healthcare Administration. So all those steps have to be followed before we can even consider skilled nursing, and it is has to be done on an annual basis. If you need help with the skilled nursing exception process, you can either work with the medical case manager in your region, or your waiver staff can help you. Let's talk about number 5, one-time or temporary needs. Environmental accessibility adaptations. So when you're requesting EAA or environmental modifications, there's specific stuff you need to provide to us, and it's listed here. So we need, if the home is rented, we have to make sure the landlord approves of the modifications. We need ownership documentation of the home by the client. The home is owned by the client or the family. We need certain bids based on the amount of the modification that you're requesting, and those are there. If you cannot obtain bids, you just need to document in your case notes or in your support plan that you attempted several other agencies and nobody was willing to provide a bid, or that no other agencies are available in the area where their consumer lives, or something like that. We just need to see that documentation. And then we would need to see the explanation of how the modification would ameliorate the need. And then if you're asking for a request over $3,500, we have to have a home accessibility assessment. So let's look at number 9. Okay, so number 9 is if there's a significant increase in the need for services after the beginning of the service plan year because of loss of Medicaid, so the individual's turning 21 and they're aging out of Medicaid state plan services, some of the things you should provide are the Medicaid prior service authorization. So if they're getting personal care assistance through Medicaid, or they're getting behavior services, then provide that documentation so that we know what was provided by Medicaid state plan. And again, you have to document that there's no other natural supports or caregivers available to provide the care. But just because you help agree to a certain number of hours of maybe nursing or personal care services, that does not automatically guarantee that the same number of units is going to be approved in the SAN. We have different criteria. We still have to follow our handbook, and we still have to determine that the hours are medically necessary. So sometimes Medicaid state plan will provide nursing for things that our personal support providers can do. And so those are some things we have to look at, and that's why we need, the specific duties that are being requested. Okay, so now I want to go down to the service-specific documentation, and let's take a look at behavior analysis and behavior assistance services. Right there. So the way we broke this up is if it's a new service request, we have kind of that separated from if you're asking for a continuation of the service. So one of the things with the behavioral services is that base form. So the behavior analysis services eligibility form that's required for certain services like behavior assistance services or behavior focused, residential rehabilitation, or intensive behavior. That form is required. So you should be working with your behavior folks in the region to request the base and make sure the base is available for the SAM review. So they're going to need some documentation. I know that all the regions have their processes in place for this to happen. So they're going to need the documentation, and then they can go ahead and complete the base and just put it directly into the consumer's record on SharePoint or eventually in iConnect. But we're going to have that base, and you should read the recommendations on the base. So if the base says, for example, behavior analysis level 1 is approved for 32 quarter hours a month or something like that, then, really that's what your recommendation should be, or what your request should be. If, behavior assistance services, we continue to get behavior assistant requests for a full year. Based on our handbook, behavior assistance services are never going to be approved for more than 6 months. So it's just going to be more aggravating for families to continue to get the denials or the partial approvals because something's being requested that we just cannot provide because of handbook limitations. So please look at that documentation when you get it. Can you go down a little bit to consumable medical supplies? Okay, for consumable medical supplies and personal care items, we need a listing of the supplies, and then we need associated costs with each item. So there is a specific rate table for developmental disabilities, the incontinence supply, I forget the official name of it, but there's a specific rate guide for those services that we have to follow for the things like the diapers and the pads and the wipes and things like that. But if it's other things that aren't specifically listed there, we need to know what the exact supply is and the cost associated. So we don't just want to list the supplies with total monthly cost, because some of the things on that supply list may not be things we can provide, and then we don't know how much to approve. And then there's some things we need a prescription for, which are listed there. So any kind of insurer, food supplement, hearing aid, you can read that on your own. There are certain things we need a prescription for. And then if you are requesting an exception above what Medicaid state plan says we can provide, like the 200 diapers or some other kind of an exception that we're allowed to look at, there's specific things you have to provide for that exception. So you have to provide a prescription, and we need a statement from the physician and ARNP or physician assistant on how the item is medically necessary and directly related to their developmental disability, and why, without the item, the client cannot continue to reside in the community or current placement. So very specific criteria that we are going to be looking for any kind of an exception. So let's go down to the life skills services. The others of these you guys can read on your own. You can send in questions if you have them. So for the life skills services, please make sure that you're looking at the stuff that we need for each one of these services. And if you're asking for more than one, then we really need some kind of a proposed schedule of usage for the services. So for Life Skills 1, the companion, we really just need some kind of documentation that includes goals related to the service that's to be performed by the provider and a daily schedule. So there has to be a goal in the plan that's specifically tied to that service. And we would like to see the service log, like at least 3 months worth of service log, so we know what the provider is doing with the consumer. For Life Skills 2, the support employment, you have to access services through VR prior to requesting funds from APD or from the waiver. So if you cannot, if VR has refused to work with your individual, or they just don't feel like that they can find something for that individual, we need some kind of documentation that proves that before we can approve any kind of funding for support employment for phase 1. Once they've successfully been employed for a certain period of time and they phase out of phase 1 and now they just need the ongoing coaching, that's different. But initially we need the information from VR. And then for ADT, for Life Skills 3, please pay attention to the ratio, the definitions, and these are the definitions from the handbook. Because because these are the things that we have to follow for the ratios you're requesting. So for the 1-to-5 ratio, you want to document, we need documentation of personal care needs, which are typically identified in the support plan, and then we're going to be looking at the QSI, or the individuals on a behavior services plan that is implemented by the ADT provider. And for the 1-to-3 ratio, it's more intense levels of personal care that the individual needs. So they really have to be lifted and transferred and things like that for their personal care needs to be met. Or they have behaviors that meet the criteria for behavior focused rehab. So even if they're not in a behavior focused setting, the behavior analysis can help us by indicating that they do meet that criteria even though they're not living in a behavior focused setting. Or you can review the criteria that's specifically identified in the handbook that someone has to meet to be qualified for behavior focus, and make sure we have that documentation somewhere in the SAM packet. So the therapies, any of the therapies, the criteria is pretty much the same. One of the things with the therapies is there are certain therapies that other resources will pay for. So you know that for all of the therapies, if somebody has Medicare Part B, Medicare pays for the services, and there is no longer a limit on the services that they will provide. They just have to determine that they're medically necessary. So as long as the therapist provides the documentation to support that the individual continues to need the therapies and they continue to be medically necessary, Medicare will continue to pay for them. And Medicaid will pay for physical and respiratory therapy for individuals over age 21, up to $1,500. And they don't have to be discharged from an outpatient facility. They just have to be able to receive the therapy in an outpatient facility. So those are things we need you to consider before requesting those funds through a SAM. For personal support, back up. Again, we really need some kind of a daily schedule and duties that the personal support provider is needed for. So this documentation can be a supplemental document to your packet, or it can be something that you put in the support plan itself. But that we really need that, and we really need some service logs. Will be helpful for us to read as well. And then for any of the residential rehabilitation services, we need to be making sure that you're looking at the ResHab rate descriptors that are on our rate table. So as part of the rate rule, not part of the this handbook or our iBudget rule, but the rate rule has specific residential rehabilitation rate descriptors that have to be met for each level. So please read those. I know oftentimes you get pressured by the residential provider because they want, a higher rate, or they just don't feel like, they just need to bring on more people or something to support that individual. But we can't go by that. We have to go by the descriptors. So make sure that the provider is educated on the descriptors, and please try and go by those when you're making your request for residential rehabilitation. We're going to go back to the PowerPoint. Okay. So I'm not going to click on the user guide. I just want to let you know that there is an iBudget SAM system user guide on the website. And when Elizabeth went onto the website to pull up the job aid, it was in the exact same location. I guess you go ahead and click on it. Okay. No, it's okay. Is this the right place? That, right there. So you see understand information. There's the additional documentation need, and then there's a thing that says for additional SAN information, including SAN manuals, click here, and that's where you would go. And there's a whole manual that tells you, that walks you through each step of the SAM process with definitions for each part of the SAN system itself. so now I want to talk about some common errors we see in the SAN system, so that we can try and eliminate these, so that it would make for a much faster review of the SAN. And I know a lot of these fields are confusing, and I've tried several different ways to explain them, either in the guide or through other means, and it's just, for some reason, it's still very confusing for people. So the first field I want to talk about is the field where you check under the fiscal year. Once you check the fiscal year, these fields show that say the SAN is requested due to an updated algorithm, and it's a yes or no option, and then reason for the aim. So again, when we talked about this just a little bit ago, when you have to submit an aim, it's because of an updated algorithm. So that you would check yes here if your consumer had a change in algorithm. So if you received an updated Easy iBudget calculator with a new algorithm amount from APD, and then you have to complete the AIM process. So that's where you would select yes there. So the AIM process was completed because you had an updated algorithm, and it resulted in a need for additional funds over the algorithm amount. That's the only time you're going to put yes in that field. You would choose no if you're just requesting a SAN and a new algorithm was not needed. So let's say your consumer's already been through iBudget implementation for the new algorithm. They've already received a notice of iBudget amount, but now maybe they need a one-time service. So maybe they need an environmental modification or durable medical equipment or something like that. But nothing else has changed, so the algorithm hasn't changed, then you would check no in that box. So the reason for AIM only populates if you're putting a yes in that first box. So the other options are new algorithm calculator for annual support plan. This option is chosen when it's part of the iBudget implementation, and you've received a new algorithm, but that's the only reason you're requesting it is because of iBudget implementation. You would choose algorithm recalculated due to a SAN request if the SAN is being requested because the agency recalculated the algorithm when the individual had a change in age, living setting, or QSI, and additional funds are needed. And there's an option for algorithm for new waiver enrollee, and you would choose this option when a SAN is being requested for a new waiver enrollee who received their first algorithm. So for this scenario, the individual has not received the notice of initial iBudget amount. Okay, so let's look at the actual SAN service screen. This is a copy of what may be on your SAN service screen. So this is an example of daily personal support. And I know the rate's not correct, so this is coming from our testing system, so I know the rates aren't correct, so disregard that. This is the top part of the SAN service screen. So in the current units field, what you should be putting is, this automatically should populate based on what is in the consumer's current cost plan. So whatever is in the current plan at the time that the SAN is created will populate there. The annualized unit, which is directly under your current units, is not what you want on an annualized basis. It's really the same thing as your current units. It was developed for kind of another purpose, and we never really changed it. But that's not, you do not enter there what you want for the full fiscal year. That comes in the second section. So you see it's tied to the field on the right that says current annualized. So your annualized units is your current plan, not what you want for the future, what they currently have on their plan as of the time the SAN is being submitted. And then this is the bottom part of the SAN service screen, and this first field, this total number of units current fiscal year, current new, is the field that I just cannot get people to understand. So we're going to try again. I've renamed it a couple times, I've tried to update the explanation in the guide, but for some reason, this is just the most confusing field for people to understand what to put. So what we need in this field is what the total number of units that the consumer needs for the current fiscal year. So it's not just the additional amount that they need, it's not the total annualized amount that they need, it's the prorated number of units they need for the current fiscal year. So for example, if a consumer already has like 12 units, so let's say on our personal support day that we're looking at, let's say they already have 12 days. But between the time that you're submitting the SAN and June 30th of this current fiscal year, the consumer needs an additional 38 days. So they have 12, they need an additional 38, so 50 is what will be populated in this field. So don't enter just the 38, which is the balance that they need, and don't enter like 100, which they may need for next fiscal year, because that's going to go in the new annualized units field underneath. So in that section, what we need to see is the total number of units they need for the current fiscal year. That's what already has been provided, plus any additional they need for the balance of the fiscal year. Now, if it's a service that's ending, so for example, maybe they had an assessment, don't put 0 there, because that budget is automatically calculated based on the units that you put here. So if the client's already been provided an assessment and you put a 0 there, that money's not going to show in their budget. We always correct that on the reviewer side, but that could cause a problem if it's not caught. So if they had one assessment, they only need the one assessment, keep the 1 in that field in the total number of units current fiscal year field, and then put a 0 in your new annualized units field. So again, the new annualized unit field should be the total number of units for a full 12 months. So that would be the following fiscal year. And then the effective date would be the date that you would need that to start. Now, you know that we cannot retroactively approve a service unless there's some special health and safety need that and the region approves and tells us to go ahead and approve it. So consider that when you're submitting this, try and submit these in advance of the need, try and be proactive so that, the consumer will have the stuff that they need. But again, if you're ending the service, the new annualized units will be 0. We see the same number carried through the screen a lot, and we don't want that because it just messes up the budget. Okay, so I think on your slide, this is not on the slides you have, there was a mistake. And so if you go to slide 19 on your slide, you'll see this screen, and then we'll come back. So this is just kind of a repeat of what we were just talking about. So if you're ending a service, then you need to make sure that the total number of current units field for the current fiscal year is prorated to reflect the total number of units needed for the current fiscal year if you're ending the service. So if, in this case, whatever the service is ending, they had 12 units, but the service is ending because they're changing services to something else. In this case, they only need 6 units for this current fiscal year. Don't 0 it out, but put the total number of units they need for this current fiscal year, and then 0 it out for new annualized units because that service is ending. Okay, so now I want to talk about the AIM worksheet. Because this is a required document. It's in our rule, and so we can't get rid of it. But we need to make sure that it's completed correctly. So one of the things that we have issues with is sometimes we have to send, requests for additional information for the algorithm amount field. The AIM has to be completed according to the rule anytime the consumer's algorithm amount changes. We talked about that. So anytime there's a change in living setting or a change in age or something else that changes the individual's algorithm amount, you have to do a new AIM worksheet. The algorithm amount that you put here should be the new algorithm amount for that individual. Because the purpose of this is for, us to be sure that you're discussing, the new amount with your consumer and their support team, and you're still, in need of additional funds. So we have to make sure that the amount that you listed there is the correct algorithm amount. We have to make sure that you're discussing the correct amount with your consumer and their family. So please make sure that you have that that you ask your region for an updated Easy iBudget calculator, and that you have the new algorithm amount, and that's the amount that you're discussing with your consumer and their support team. Now this section is supposed to indicate how the individual meets the criteria for significant additional needs funding. So we don't want to see blank lines like it shows here. And we don't want to see just a listing of services, but you should be demonstrating. So we went over the criteria in the beginning of the webinar that you have to meet to request funding for for additional needs, additional funds. So please make sure that you're identifying in this section why they need additional funds and how they meet that same criteria that we went over earlier. So individual's parent, passed away unexpectedly, and additional funds are needed to keep them safe in the community or something like that. But not just blank, not just a listing of services, but a demonstration of, how they meet the SAM criteria. And then in your grids, so there's 3 different grids. So the first grid should reflect your current cost plan. So the units that you put in this grid should be the same number of units that the individual has in their current cost plan. And then the second grid, this is what should match the SAM service grade. So this is the number of units that you are requesting for the additional funds. So we're always going to be trying to match this against your SAM service screens to make sure that what you're requesting in the SAM is what your consumer and family agreed that they're asking for. And so your current units column would be the current number of units in the plan, and then you would let us know what the annualized unit need is. If there's a change from the time that you submitted the SAM, before it's reviewed, that something happens, or you forgot a service, or there was a change in need for a service, then you can always put updated information in the notes section of the SAM, even if it's sitting in the region queue or if it's sitting in the state office queue. You can always add stuff to the notes section of the SAM. So if there is a change, please submit an updated AIM and put on the AIM that this has been updated from the original one so that we know exactly what we're looking for, and that we know we may have to add more services to the SAM service screens when we're doing the review. So now I just want to go over some things that would help with a successful SAM process, both for make it less aggravating for APD staff and support coordinators, and then there will be time for some questions. Okay, so you know that we went over the SAM criteria. So again, we want to make sure that when you're requesting additional funds, that it's truly extraordinary needs that will place the health and safety of the client's caregiver, or the public in immediate serious jeopardy unless the increase is approved. And again, I want to emphasize that both Director Palmer and legislatures downtown, this is something that they are very focused on and something that we have to follow. A client should not move. They shouldn't change their living setting if there's inadequate funds to meet the needs for a full year before you request additional funds, unless it's a health and safety emergency. So if the client is living in the family home and everything's fine, but they just decide they want to move into their own apartment, so you go ahead and move them into their own apartment, and you set them up with supports and services, and then you submit the SAN. Well, there's no guarantee that what you set them up with is going to be approved. So please try and plan ahead, be proactive. If it's not a health and safety emergency, then go ahead and request the funds first before you move the individual. And if you're moving them into a group home, please make sure you're looking at those red tab indicators. So if it's an emergency and they have to move before you can submit the SAN, make sure that you are looking at the red tab indicators, because we don't want, the group home operator to think that they're getting paid for a higher rate than we can really approve in the SAN, because it could jeopardize the placement later on. And please make sure that services meet medical necessity criteria. So that criteria is in our handbook, and we use it all the time for references. So the medical necessity criteria is that the service has to be necessary to protect life, significant illness or disability, or alleviate severe pain. It has to be individualized, specific, and consistent with symptoms or confirmed diagnoses of the illness or injury under treatment, and not in excess of the patient's needs. It has to be consistent with generally accepted professional medical standards as determined by the Medicaid program, and not experimental or investigational. It must be reflective of the level of service that can be safely furnished, and for which no equally effective or more conservative or less costly treatment is available statewide. And it must be furnished in a manner that's not primarily intended for the convenience of the recipient, their caretaker, or the provider. So those are some things we always look at for every SAN determination. So for consumer-directed care plus participants, the SAN should reflect waiver services and not services on the purchasing plan. So if your consumer is buying things through CDC that are allowed through the CDC handbook, but not necessarily on the waiver handbook, don't put those on your SAN request, because those are things we cannot consider. We can only consider services that are part of the iBudget handbook. And then try and be proactive. So you can include all services a person may need. We see several instances where we receive, a SAN for the same person every 3 months or something like that, and one little thing changes, and it just backs up the reviewer and causes it to take a lot more time for it to be approved. So try and be more proactive. So if you know that there's something the consumer needs now, but maybe they're going to be aging out of the school system before the end of the current fiscal year, go ahead and be proactive and consider the services a person may need if they're graduating from school, and include it all on the same SAN. And that will make for more effective, use of the time. And then on the notice, remember that the only units that show on the notice that we send out are the units on the current cost plan, and then the annualized approved services. We don't include prorated amounts on the notice, and this is the direction that we got from our legal department, so it cannot be changed. So if you need to see the prorated units approved for the current year while you're building your cost plan, please look at the SAN service screen. And then follow those units when you're creating your cost plan, because the SAN system automatically calculates the budget based on the units that are put there. So if you follow those units when you're building your plan, there should not be an issue with budget. And then the last thing I want to mention before we go to questions is I don't know what the support coordinators have on their side, because I can't see it as a support coordinator, but I don't know if it's in your list of activities or something that shows that a SAN is pending. Please do not mark anything complete that is a SAN that's still pending. As if you mark it complete on your side as the support coordinator, it disappears off the region or state office queues, and then we don't want to ever miss a SAN that is pending. So once the SAN is complete and we mark it complete, it will come off whatever list of activities or queue that you guys have. So please don't do it prior to the SAN being completed.
Okay, if you guys have, some questions, I know we got a few while Cheryl was presenting, but we just have a few short minutes. Go ahead, send those questions in the chat box, to ensure that they come to me or Cheryl. Make sure you, indicate in the drop-down menu that you want to send your questions to all the hosts, or you can choose our name specifically. So I'll give you guys just a few moments to go over that, and then we'll go through them. Okay, so I'm going to start and go through some of these questions. If I happen to miss any, or if we can't get to it, then send them to me in email so that we can address them privately. So the first one, can the waiver pay for transportation to waiver-funded therapies?
So a couple years ago, this was considered as part of for the therapies. However, all of the consumers now have that CNET managed care thing as part of their Medicaid. Everybody has that. It's on you'll see it like in the FEMA system. It's called CNET. It's part of the transportation system, and that transportation actually will pay for the consumer to get to their therapy. So look into the CNET first before you ask for waiver-funded therapy services. Right now, I think a couple years ago it was decided that we might be able to pay for those therapy services, and I think that still stands. But you need to try getting it through the CNET managed care thing first. WCs have been advised to complete and if the total services exceed that. Okay, so it says WCs have been advised to complete SANs if the total services exceed the EZ. So the EZ is the individual's algorithm amount. Anytime a consumer needs funding over the algorithm amount, it is considered a SAN.
Can APD have a standard procedure for those that are transitioning from Medicaid state plan to have at least 3 months of behavior analysis services and behavior
assistant, maybe behavior therapy?
Until the therapist makes the official presentation for the base.
So we've talked about this quite a bit, and really, if you know somebody's aging out and you have the document, you need to try to get them to the LRC before you submit the SAN. That's best practice. The only thing we can really do is approve like 100 quarter hours of behavior analysis to get you started. We can't approve behavior assistance services without the base because it's a specific requirement in the handbook. So that we can't do. So the best practice would be for you to make sure those documents get to the LRC, prior to the individual turning 21 and aging out of the service. Okay, so if the rate is changed, if your consumer's on CDC Plus and the reviewer changes it from agency to solo, we do give 35 days advance notice. So usually, let's say you're doing a SAN now and the decision is made today, we would continue the agency rate probably through March. So we should always be giving 35 days advance notice prior to making the change. And if you don't see that, then you just need to let your region liaison know, and they can let us know. Medicaid PT is for anyone or under specific circumstances. So the Medicaid physical therapy for individuals over age 21, the only condition is that the person has to be able to go to an outpatient facility. So if they can't go to an outpatient facility to receive their therapy, you just need to make sure that that's documented somewhere, either on the therapist's documentation or in your support plan. So if the individual's homebound and therapy is being provided in the home and they don't have Medicare, or if they're getting it at some other day program, you just have to make sure that that's documented somewhere in the documentation you're providing so we can see that. A residential habit here focus does not request requirements. Behavior focus does not request I'm not sure what that means. I'm sorry, can you repeat that box? Is what is currently.
That's about that means. Amanda Johnson, can you expand on your question about the unit box on the AIM? Which section did you want clarification on? We'll get to it. Just send it back into the chat.
When a notice of iBudget is given after the SAN is given to the consumer, there are services that have partial approval. How do you want us to address that? What is the time frame for approval of the services partially approved? So that's the same as what we were talking about with the agency to solo changes. We always give a minimum of 35 days advance notice of any kind of a change that we're making. So if it's a reduction, then we're going to give you, time, and they already have the service in their plan, we're reducing it, we're going to give the 35 days notice, additional, the funds at the current rate for an additional 35 days. So you have time to adjust or do request a hearing. If it's not a service that's started yet, then you just need to follow the units that are partially approved in the SAN services section. Make sure that your cost plan matches the amount that's been approved in the SAN. When a notice of iBudget is given based on a SAN, can the issuer add those pre-approved services? Okay, so the question is, when we do a SAN, can we add the pre-approved services automatically to the cost plan? That's the function of the region liaison. So the region is notified that also when a SAN is approved, and so work with your liaisons to get those services added. But that is a function for the regional liaisons to do. The annualized unit section would include current and annualized units needed for the remainder of the current fiscal year. The section we were talking about, the total number of units, the prorated section, is the section that would include the current and annualized, is the current needs for the current fiscal year, and the annualized unit section is the total number of units needed for the following fiscal year. For the AIM second chart services requested for current cost per year or the total for the whole 12 months. It's both. There's two different sections on the AIM itself. They have the current unit section that it will be the same thing that should match your that weird field we talked about for the prorated section of the current fiscal year, and then it automatically does the math. So you put the prorated units in the first section, you put your annualized units in the second section, and the AIM automatically does the math for those services. So it's both. how do you want to address when we notice a calculation error on the notice of iBudget? A calculation error, just let your regional liaison know, and they'll let us know, and we can, open it back up and do the correction.
You can find the copy of the job aid, up on the APD website. If you go to the support coordination page, it is listed, towards the top, above all of the support plan materials. And if for some reason you're having a hard time finding it or whatnot, you can always just send Elizabeth an email, and I'll send it to you.
Can you repeat slide 19? I think it's a standard slide. So someone wants to go over slide 19 again, which I believe, I'll see their 19 is. Their 19 is this. Their 19 is this one. Yeah. I hope this is the one you're talking about. The iBudget SAN system. Okay. So what this is if you need to end a service. So, you know, it's a service that maybe the consumer is currently receiving personal support, but is requesting residential habilitation. Then your top two boxes are still going to be what's on the current cost plan. So let's say they have, 12 units of whatever service for the current cost plan year, but they're going to be changing, and so they really only need 6 for this current fiscal year. Then you're going to keep the 12 for the top 2 sections because that's what's on your current plan, and then you're going to reflect what's needed for the current fiscal year. So in this case, only 6 units would be needed for the current fiscal year, and it's not needed for the next fiscal year. So 0 units is there for the next fiscal year. But again, please make sure that you keep the number of units you need for the current fiscal year there where the 6 shows on the screen now, because otherwise the budget will be short. To request an increase in BS. To request an increase in behavior focus, yes, a base is required. Doing a SAN for a person who did not go through the annual review with algorithm, did not receive letter for new iBudget, and algorithm has been requested, do I check doing a SAN due to updated algorithm? So if a person has not been through iBudget implementation process, then yes, go ahead and get your new algorithm amount and do it for, check yes for receiving a new algorithm. So I know we still have about 12,000 people who have not yet been through the process, and so yeah, we need to get them through the process. Okay, so there's a question about if there's an issue with the LRC approval. So if we get approval for behavior system services, I guess, signed on, say, 2/8 for service to extend 6 months for April through October. Then we get approval from signature date, not needed date, thus we get only 4 months approval, not 6 months. So it depends on, like, we go by what the base says, and we can't retroactively approve. And so, if the based on the date that the LRC approved it, that's what we're going to take our 6 months to be. And if there's a different date range that's needed, you can let your area behavior analyst know, and they can put that in the notes of the base that they're submitting to us. So we usually go by what's currently in the system and the date that the LRC is approving it, the date span they're approving it from. So you may already have some behavior system services during the period of time that is included in the base. We can't extend it beyond the 6 months that is approved on the base because there's a specific reason for those reviews. And remember, behavior assistance services are intended to be a time-limited service. which is why it's only approved for 6 months at a time. It's not intended to be an ongoing service for years and years and years. And so the intent is that they are training the people, the caregivers that are around the individual all the time, and then they're supposed to work themselves out of that job, which is why we only do it for 6 months at a time. You need to complete the AIM worksheet if you're increasing level of red tab but not changing the living setting, but QSI scores may be different. It depends on whether the algorithm amount changes. That's the whole thing that you need to consider on whether you need to consider AIM worksheet or not. So if there's no change in living settings but certain questions on the QSI change that did change the algorithm, then yeah, you would have to do the AIM. But if the algorithm amount did not change and they're just changing their level, then no, you do not need to do an AIM. There's a question about, what about a behavior assessment that is needed? Do we do a SAN requesting more money, then turn around after assessment and send an entire SAN again? This is one of the things that we kind of talked about a little bit about being more proactive. You should be able to find the funds for the assessment within your current cost plan. It's like $274, so you should be able to, maybe the person didn't use all their personal supports, or maybe they didn't use some other service in the plan. You can free those funds up for a behavior assessment. That's something you should do prior to requesting a SAN, so that we're not doing multiple SANs, just a few months later. So that's kind of what we were talking about with being proactive. Try and get that funded first, and then just submit for whatever the recommendation is. Dental services no longer available in the SANS request. We're still working on this. We're still working with ACA on dental services. Right now, we need the support coordinator to start working with the individual on accessing their dental services through the dental managed care plans. Right, I know they're still working on signing dentists up, and so maybe some limited availability. We're continuing to allow dental services through June, but we need the support parent to be working with the consumer and accessing those other resources first. And then we're kind of still working on a plan for what we can continue to approve for next fiscal year, and we'll get that out to you as soon as the decision is made. You have to attach transportation contracts when requesting continuation of transportation. We have a list of approved transportation rates. So as long as the amount that you're asking for matches what the provider has already been approved for, you don't have to attach anything else. That's their service. I don't know what that is. I guess I was in the middle. Can you send out the correct current rate descriptors for Red Tab? It's on the website, in the iBudget waiver website under. Okay. Under users. And I'm going to go to keep on. Yeah. Right there, the waiver provider rate table. Right there. If you, yeah, and then if you scroll down, right there is your Red Tab rate descriptor. If a SAN has been approved for a CDC individual and there is a hearing pending, can the WSC adjust the cost when requesting new services not approved in the SAN? I'm not sure I understand that. And any detect.
Would it be CDC services?
I don't know. Can you clarify that question? We'll, if we can't capture it now, we'll capture it later. I guess you do FAQs.
Yeah.
It Elizabeth does FAQs, so if you can, I'm not sure what that means, if you can give me a better question or expand on that, then we'll answer it later.
Sure.
I'll address this long one separately. If the service was inadvertently left off of SAN, are you indicating that if SAN was closed, can it be reopened or must a new SAN be submitted? If the service is critical, like a health and safety need, we can re-look at it again because it saves more time than having to do a whole new SAN. But, you know, please make sure that you're double checking everything before you submit the SAN. Make sure everything's accounted for, and it is, you know, if you could go ahead, like I said, you can always put new documentation if the SAN is still pending in the note section of the SAN. So if you catch it before the SAN is completed, you can go ahead and put that documentation in the note section of the SAN. You want to answer that one? Can the regions be provided access to the transportation spreadsheet? I'll have Kent send something out about where that is.
Okay, so at this point, I'm sure most of you have received your assessment link in your email. You are welcome to begin that test now, but it cannot be discussed on the call. So it is a private assessment, so you need to answer those questions to the best of your ability. Any questions that we may have missed or that we identified that we would answer separately, we will be in touch. I'll work on an FAQ, and as that becomes developed, we'll send it out to everyone. But at this point, if there is no other comments from Cheryl or the team, I think we're at a good place to finish up. Okay, so go ahead, try to take your assessment. If you're running into technical difficulties, send me an email, and we will try to figure out what's going on. Also, since this training went a little bit longer than originally scheduled, we will make adjustments to your credits earned so that you guys can receive 1.5 credits instead of the standard 1. That will not be reflected on your test results page because that's already been set up, but we will notify all the appropriate people so they know that this training was for 1.5 credits. So thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it. I hope that it was helpful. And if you have any other questions, just send them on over to Elizabeth or Cheryl. Thank you all.